On the 20th of August 2018, Debbie Porter, a registered paramedic for the Southwestern Ambulance Service NHS Trust, responded to a 999 call. Porter was the lead paramedic as she attended to a 31-year-old male with a chief complaint of diarrhea and vomiting. Porter did not conduct a thorough assessment of the patient and deemed transport to hospital unnecessary. If his symptoms persisted, she suggested he call his GP or to call 999 if symptoms worsened. Porter discharged the patient and left him at home with his wife. A follow-up call was received from the patient's wife stating the patient's health had rapidly declined. Upon the second ambulance's crew's arrival, the patient was in cardiac arrest, and despite emergency resuscitation efforts, the patient was announced deceased. A combination of Porter's failings contributed to the death of the patient and will be observed in the context of Queensland law. Firstly, it must be examined what duty of care Queensland paramedics owe to their patients. The 1932 case of Donoghue v. Stevenson established the principle of duty of care, and it was then expanded upon in the Civil Liability Act of 2003. Additionally, in Queensland, Porter would be bound by the Australian Health Practitioner Regulatory Agency AHPRA, which outlines the code of conduct and regulates the standards of care and management for healthcare professionals. AHPRA operates under the Health Practitioner Regulation national law to ensure practitioners work in a way that protects the public. Domain 5, the paramedic practitioner, specifically relates to Porter's case, as it highlights the profession-specific knowledge and skills and capabilities required for a registered paramedic. It is clear that Porter would have owed her patient a duty of care and proves the first component of negligence. Now, it must be understood how this standard of care was breached. But what standard of care did Porter owe her patient? And were her actions negligent or acceptable? The Civil Liability Act of 2003 establishes that if an action is widely accepted by peer professionals, there is no case for a breach of duty. However, it explains that peer professional opinion is not the only source of reference. Statutory provisions imposing a standard of care, such as the AHPRA Codes of Practice and Conduct, as well as the QAS Clinical Practice Manuals, could assist in understanding the failings in Porter's practice. Porter failed to conduct a thorough clinical assessment of the patient's presentation, resulting in insufficient treatment. Porter failed to treat the patient in response to an oxygen saturation reading of 83%, as she did not provide the patient with the oxygen or further assessment to determine the reason behind the low reading. Additionally, the patient was not conveyed to hospital, nor was the interaction correctly documented. Porter incorrectly documented the patient's oxygen saturation reading without reason, did not record any issues with the MobiMed device, falsely reported a blood pressure reading that had not been taken, incorrectly stated that the patient had normal skin color, and did not record a provisional or differential diagnosis. Several studies highlight that the patient's presentation as a result of severe fluid loss from vomiting and diarrhea has resulted in adverse effects, including major neurological deficits and, if left untreated, death. This demonstrates that the risk and significance of harm was foreseeable. Furthermore, QAS's drug therapy protocols indicate that oxygen is necessary for any stage of hypoxia. Thus, a reasonable QAS paramedic would know to administer oxygen to prevent harm to the patient. Queensland courts would then use the calculus of negligence, a 4-factor assessment to examine whether a reasonable person would have taken the necessary precautions. The calculus of negligence can be investigated by evaluating Porter as a medical professional, her following of protocols, understanding of pathophysiology, and determining her fitness to practice. It is known that Porter had 7 previous blemish-free years' experience at the UK Paramedic Trust, and it can be assumed as an experienced paramedic she would have encountered presentations similar to that of this patient, thereby knowing the relevant treatment and protocols. Porter failed to meet the Australian standard of care according to AHPRA, as well as relevant legislation, and evidently breached her duty of care to the patient. The final element to determine Porter guilty, according to the tort of negligence, is establishing causation, which is essential to determine liability. Therefore, it needs to be proven that Porter's misconduct was the direct cause of death of the patient. The Civil Liability Act states that for a breach of duty to have caused harm, there are 2 elements: factual causation and the scope of liability. Factual causation is demonstrating that the injury was caused directly by the defendant's failure. As previously established, Porter's actions were dishonest and constitute misconduct, clearly in breach of duty of care. Furthermore, it is clear that Porter's negligence caused the death of the patient, as this would have been avoided if the correct assessment and treatment was provided. Therefore, Porter should be held liable for her acts of negligence. Additionally, her negligence caused significant damage, not only to the patient in death, but in emotional distress to the patient's family. Section 61 of the Civil Liability Act is the assessment used by the court for the scale of injury. Sadly, the death of the patient was a reasonably foreseeable consequence of the defendant's negligence, and Porter would be awarded 100, as death is the gravest conceivable kind. Porter has acted under the tort of negligence, and her crimes and consequences entail fraudulent falsification of records and negligent acts causing harm. Both of these crimes are punishable with imprisonment under the Criminal Code Act. Porter has breached Section 430, which can result in imprisonment with a maximum penalty of 10 years. Furthermore, Porter breached Section 328, negligent acts causing harm. Therefore, Porter's crimes should result in imprisonment in the state of Queensland. The case of Porter demonstrates a clear breach of duty of care, resulting in the fatality of the patient and damages to relatives. Healthcare practitioners in Queensland are required to abide to the AHPRA Code of Conduct, as well as relevant legislation. Porter's case presented a paramedic that failed to meet the required expectations under AHPRA registration, and consequently her actions would result in mandatory notification to AHPRA. Porter showed a significant departure from accepted professional standards, ultimately resulting in the death of her patient. The mandatory notification and complaint would result in an informal investigation. Due to the substantial risk Porter would pose to public safety, her registration would be immediately suspended and her attendance required at a tribunal hearing for professional misconduct. It would conclude that along with her failure to provide duty of care, she also committed 2 criminal offences: negligent acts causing harm and fraudulent falsification of records, both punishable with imprisonment. Ultimately, in the state of Queensland, a paramedic that displays the actions outlined by this case would result in a minimum of cancellation of registration.